investment decisions, all human decisions carry with them some degree of risk and some frequency of bad things happening. And at some point, we have to acknowledge that there are bad things that happen. The transportation of these very dangerous carcinogenic chemicals is a key part of what makes the economy work. It drives a lot of industry. It gives us all access to products and things that matter in our lives. And there are these occasional bad things that happen. Maybe you can add more kind of safety features, but at some point you can only do so much. And then the question is, are we willing to take that risk relative to the reward or the benefit we get for them? Versus taking every time something bad happens, like, hey, I lost money in the stock market and I want to go find someone to blame for that.
I think that blame is an emotional reaction, but I think a lot of people are capable of putting the emotional reaction aside and asking the more important logical question, which is who's responsible? I think what Sachs asked is, hey, I just want to know who is responsible for these things. And Friedberg, you're right. I think there are a lot of emotionally sensitive people who need a blame mechanic to deal with their own anxiety. But there are, I think, an even larger number of people who are calm enough to actually see through the blame and just ask, where does the responsibility lie? It's the same example with the Zantac thing. I think we're going to figure out, how did Glaxo, how are they able to cover up a cancer-causing carcinogen sold over the counter via this product called Zantac, which tens of millions of people around the world took for 40 years, that now it looks like causes cancer? How are they able to cover that up for 40 years? I don't think people are trying to find a single person to blame, but I think it's important to figure out who's responsible. What was the structures of government or corporations that failed? And how do you either rewrite the law or punish these guys monetarily so that this kind of stuff doesn't happen again? That's an important part of a self-healing system that gets better over time.
Right. And I would just add to it, I think it's not just lame, but I think it's too fatalistic just to say, oh, shit happens. Statistically, a train derailment's going to happen 1 out of, n
I'm not brushing it off. I'm just saying, we always jump to blame, right? We always jump to blame on every circumstance that happens. And
this is This is a true environmental disaster for the people who are living in Ohio.
I totally agree.
And I'm not sure that statistically the rate of derailment makes sense. I mean, we've now heard about a number of these train derailments. There
was another one today, by the way. There was another one today. Breaking news.
So I think there's a larger question of what's happening in terms of the competence of our government administrators, our regulators, our industries.
But Sachs, you often pivot to that. And that's my point. Like when things go wrong in industry, in FTX, in all these in a train derailment, our current kind of training for all of us, not just you, but for all of us, is to pivot to which government person can I blame, which political party can I blame for causing the problem. Blame. And you saw how much Pete Buttigieg got beat up this week because they're like, well, he's the head of the Department of Transportation. He's responsible for this. Let's figure out a way to now make him to blame, right?
I have nothing.
Isn't that accountability?
I have nothing against Pete Buttigieg.
Yeah.
It is accountability. Listen, powerful people need to be held accountable. That was the original mission of the media, but they don't do that anymore. They show no interest in stories where powerful people are doing wrong things if the media agrees with the agenda of those powerful people. We're seeing it here. We're seeing it with the Twitter files. There was zero interest in the exposés of the Twitter files. Why? Because the media doesn't really have an interest in exposing the permanent government or deep state's involvement in censorship. They simply don't. They actually agree with it. They believe in that censorship.
Right.
Yeah.
The media has shown zero interest in getting to the bottom of what actions our State Department took, or generally speaking, our security state took, that might have led up to the Ukraine war. Zero interest in that. So I think this is partly a media story where the media quite simply is agenda driven. And if a true disaster happens that doesn't fit with their agenda, they're simply going to ignore it.
I hate to agree with Sachs so strongly here, but I think people are waking up to the fact that they're being manipulated by this group of elites, whether it's the media, politicians, or corporations, or acting in some, weird ecosystem where they're feeding into each other with investments or advertisements, et cetera. No, I think the media is failing here. They're supposed to be holding the politicians, the corporations, and the organizations accountable. And because they're not, and they're focused on bread and circuses and distractions that are not actually important, then you get the sense that our society is incompetent or unethical and that there's no transparency and that, there are forces at work that are not actually acting in the interest of the citizens. And
I think the explanation is much simpler.
It sounds like a conspiracy theory, but I think it's actual reality.
That's what I was going to say. I think the explanation is much simpler and a little bit sadder than this. So, for example, we saw today another example of government inefficiency and failure was when that person resigned from the FTC. She basically said this entire department is basically totally corrupt and Lina Khan is utterly ineffective. And if you look under the hood, well, it makes sense. Of course she's ineffective. We're asking somebody to manage businesses who doesn't understand business because she's never been a business person, right? She fought this knockdown, drag out case against Meta for them buying a few $1 million like VR exercising app, like it was the end of days. And the thing is, she probably learned about Meta at Yale, but Meta's not theoretical. It's a real company. Right. And so if you're going to deconstruct companies to make them better, you should be steeped in how companies actually work, which typically only comes from working inside of companies. And it's just an example where, but what did she have? She had the bona fides within the establishment, whether it's education or whether it's the dues that she paid in order to get into a position where she was now able to run an incredibly important organization. But she's clearly demonstrating that she's highly ineffective at it because she doesn't see the forest from the trees. Amazon and Roomba, Facebook and this exercise app, but all of this other stuff goes completely unchecked. Right. And I think that is probably emblematic of what many of these government institutions are being run like.
Let me cue up this issue just so people understand, and then I'll go to you, Sachs. Christine Wilson is an FTC commissioner, and she said she'll resign over Lina Khan's disregard for the rule, and there's a quote, disregard for the rule of law and due process. She wrote, since Mrs. Khan's confirmation in 2021, my staff and I have spent countless hours seeking to uncover her abuses of government power. That task has become increasingly difficult as she has consolidated power within the office of the chairman, breaking decades of bipartisan precedent and undermining the commission structure that Congress wrote into law. I've sought to provide transparency and facilitate accountability through speeches and statements, but I face constraints on the information I can disclose, many legitimate, but some manufactured by Ms. Khan and the Democrats' majority to avoid embarrassment. Basically,
brutal.
Yeah. I mean, this is, oof, she lit the building on fire.
That's brutal.
Yeah. Let me tell you the mistake that Lina Khan made.
Go ahead, Sachs.
Yeah. So here's the mistake that I think Lina Khan made. She diagnosed the problem of big tech to be bigness. I think both sides of the aisle now all agree that big tech is too powerful and